In many of them, and in the Buddhist writings, you often hear about delusion, greed, aversion, delusion, lobha, dosa, and moha. So, people can get their head around greed, can get their head around aversion, but often delusion is kind of regarded as something that's not directly my responsibility, in as much as greed is, or aversion.
I don't know what I don't know.
Yeah, so it's regarded in sort of a semi-metaphysical sense, as in it's there, but it's not really something I can directly experience. But actually it is. Delusion is an attitude of your mind, in as much greed or lust and aversion are. Otherwise it wouldn't have been mentioned always like that.
Right. Yeah.
So from that point of view, delusion, it's more of like an attitude of indolence, laziness,
choice to keep things cloudy. Yeah.
Exactly, keeping it opaque intentionally, not turning a blind eye, distracting yourself intentionally with things that are going to take your mind away from yourself. So you realize delusion is a very active thing. And as the Buddha said, that's why it's the most blameworthy, actually, because it's the hardest to undo as well. Mm-hmm. But the fact that you can undo it means it's not this metaphysical lack of knowledge. It's your very attitude. That it's even more fundamental than the attitude of lust and the attitude of aversion. They're kind of secondary to it. Lust requires a basis of delusion. Aversion requires a basis of delusion. Delusion requires a basis of delusion. So you're deluded through and through, not because you don't know certain things, but because you perpetually act out of ignorance that then maintains yourself in the situation of ignorance. And situation of ignorance, again, it's not ignorance as in you don't know something. It's you actively ignoring and giving priority to the ignoring of it. So choosing to distract yourself, for example. So actively making a choice that will result in certain actions that are not necessarily lustful or hateful, but are based upon you not wanting to be self-aware, for example. So entertainment or distraction in general. Oh, I'm bored by myself because I'm aware of everything and it's very unpleasant. So I'll just go and chat to some people randomly. Not for sensual reasons or because I hate them, just because I want something to do. So often needing things to do is rooted in delusion, as in distraction, as in indolence, on the level of, like you can be very diligent externally, he's doing all this work, but the reasons for you doing that work are rooted in you wanting to turn a blind eye in regard to yourself. You don't want to be self-aware, basically.
You don't want to see the truth of your mind.
Well, yeah, because that will result in the unpleasant truths of your mind, or simply unpleasant states of boredom and so on. So I better find something to do. I better find an external purpose.
Yes, that doing.
It will occupy my mind, so my mind won't be aware of itself, because being aware of itself is too unpleasant, is too threatening.
It's a way of keep covering up the truth.
Exactly.
The cover up.
It's the way of maintaining yourself in a state of cover-up. Yeah.
Keep the dust moving.
Exactly. So otherwise, if it settles, you get to see what's there, and it's unpleasant.
That's the thing. You say self-aware. Sounds like a good thing, but it's like the most painful thing.
It is. Yeah.
You know, and the thing most people avoid.
Yeah, that's why solitude is very unpleasant to begin with. Yeah. That's why, as the Buddha himself said many times, he practices so you develop the pleasure of solitude. You won't get it right away. If done rightly, it's unpleasant. Because you're going against the grain of all the distraction you got used to it and that your existence depends upon. But that's it. Like when you get into when you stop maintaining all these attitudes they were based upon obscuring the self-awareness. So when you stop feeding those attitudes, the self-awareness increases. But it feels like the boredom starts giving rise to dread and anxiety. Feels like you yourself are drowning. It's crushing you. But what is actually crushing is your assumed level of your own being, the one that you've been proliferating. It's not actually crushing you. Like being alone in your room, not seeing or talking to anyone, cannot do anything to you. But yeah, your mind can sort of drown in it. Because the mind became dependent upon a certain degree of engagement with the world. That is its threshold. But that's not a static thing, that threshold. Which means the more you engage, the more dependent upon engagement you become. The less engage, well, initially it might hurt the lesser engagement because you used to engage more, but then you get used to that. And then it will not be unpleasant. In the same sense, like you have a very hectic person who's been sort of doing a lot, engaging a lot, working a lot, for whatever reasons. And then if he was made to sit down and stop engaging to that level, the discrepancy would be just too much to handle. But if he gradually starts doing that and then starts ceasing his engagement, he'll get used to that new level of lacking the engagement that he used to have. Which means you are responsible for the threshold of where your being is. That's what when it says his consciousness gets established upon that. Like that becomes the norm, that becomes what you're used to, which means anything less than that is going to fill you with anxiety and dread. But it's important to recognize that it's not a static thing. So through using engagement with the world, actions, meaningless work, whatever else, or not even finding meaning for your work, whatever. Practically, you're engaging with the world for the means of escaping self-awareness. So you will become dependent on that level of engagement. Anything less than that engagement will bring you back to your self-awareness. So that means then you have to keep maintaining the level of your engagement, and once you get used to it, you have to keep increasing it if you try to use it to avoid self-awareness. And most people to a degree are using that. That's why most people are afraid to be alone. Not afraid from like some, monsters and stuff, but afraid just in broad daylight being left alone in their room for a whole day. Without doing anything, without taking my mind away from myself. That's why most people would be afraid to be left alone. It would result in experiencing anxiety and existential dread. Because the human life on average is about avoiding that self-awareness, which ties in with avoiding responsibility and feeds one another and so on.
But that self-awareness is the thing that's going to make things right, in a way.
Exactly. That's why people are, because of their own actions, they're liable to suffering because of that, not because of someone else's fault or some design. It's because you act in a manner that keeps making you liable to suffer, keeps you exposed. So you could then, if you take responsibility for it, that's where what I'm saying might become apparent. That the level of engagement, the level of distraction, the level of turning a blind eye, it's not a static thing. Which means you can, the way you've been kind of proliferating it, you can then also undo it if you stop engaging with it. Or you can certainly put the brakes on its growth. That's why the bhava in the suttas being, again, it's not a metaphysical thing, it's the level of your dependence on the senses, which is central being. The level of dependence on the sense of the world, the duty, the perception thing you perceive around, the level you depend on it. But then you can start depending less. That's why Arahant has cessation of his being. He doesn't depend on anything. But he's still there. It's not that the being means destruction. No, being means assumption. Assumption of engagement, assumption of avoiding responsibility, assumption of sensuality. And that's what delusion is. That ignoring, turning a blind eye, distracting yourself, not being able to live with yourself. And again, you can ask back onto that practical level that we always do, why is it that I don't want to be self-aware? Why is it that I need to distract myself from myself? Because it's unpleasant. So why am I then maintaining this whole level of being for which I'm responsible, level of how much I depend on engagement with things? Oh, it's because I don't want to suffer.
But failing to see that my very engagement is
the root of your suffering, exactly, yeah. So why do I suffer then? Oh, it's because I keep running away from suffering. That's why I suffer. So if I stop running away from suffering, I at least have a chance to not suffer.